The chamber is thick with heat, though the fires burn low. Tallow candles gutter in their holders, their greasy smoke curling toward the beams above. The scent of melted wax and singed wick mingles with something sharper, dried rosemary, lavender, bitter yarrow, herbs crushed beneath the midwife's hands and thrown into the air as if to summon protection. The walls are stone, old enough to remember sieges, their surface damp in the cold. Shadows slide across them, cast by the restless movements of women who cannot keep still. There is no sound of comfort here. Only the scrape of a stool leg on flagstone. The slow pour of water into a copper basin. The rustle of linen pulled tight between fists. The stillness is not peace but suspension, a taut, trembling moment before something breaks. On the bed lies a girl, her body swallowed by heavy sheets. Her face is slick with sweat, hair plastered to her temples, her lips cracked from breathing in short, sharp bursts. She is 13 years old, her bones still fine and narrow, her shoulders still slight beneath the weight of the linen. Her belly, swollen and tense, rises like a foreign shape that does not belong to her. Every few moments, her fingers clench into the bedding, knuckles whitening, and the women around her lean closer, watching. In the corners of the room, midwives whisper to one another in Latin, the syllables fast and clipped, not meant for her ears. A phrase repeats itself in their muttering, and it carries through the air like a verdict, a child trying to bring forth a child. The words are not cruel, only resigned, spoken as women who have seen this before and know what such nights can take. Beyond the chamber, the castle is silent, though it is not the silence of sleep. The stone corridors are waiting, holding their breath, as if the building itself understands the weight of this night. Outside, the wind pushes against the shutters, dragging its cold fingers along the gaps, letting in thin threads of winter air. Somewhere below, on the lower floors, footsteps echo faintly, men keeping watch not for her cries, but for the outcome. This is not a birth as most would know it. It is an event arranged and anticipated like the signing of a treaty or the fall of a city. Those waiting do not count the hours of her labor, they count the value of what will emerge. She knows it, too. Knows she was never meant to be only herself. She was chosen, bound, and placed here because her body carried the chance of producing an heir whose life might decide the fate of England. Her breathing quickens, a low sound escapes her throat, and one of the midwives moves to her side, laying a hand on her damp brow. In the candlelight, her eyes open and find nothing soft to rest on. This is not the face of a mother in waiting, but of a child in a place where childhood has no use. In the stillness before the first true cry, you understand, the night will not end when the child is born. It will echo for decades, in war and in court, in betrayal and in blood. And long after the pain has left her body, the shadow of this room will never leave her. Before the night of pain and candlelight, before the stone chamber and the watching midwives, she was a child in a world that had no patience for childhood. Margaret Beaufort was born into a name that carried both privilege and peril. Her blood traced back to John of Gaunt, the powerful Duke of Lancaster, fourth son of Edward III. It was a line that could be called noble in one breath and dangerous in the next. For in 15th century England, a claim to the throne was not a blessing, it was an invitation to be used, watched, or destroyed. Her father, John Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, was a man favoured at court yet shadowed by misfortune. He died when Margaret was barely old enough to remember his face. Officially, it was said to be illness. Quiet voices hinted at poison. Others whispered that he chose death rather than bear the shame of military defeat. The truth never settled, but the consequence was clear. Margaret became the sole heir to the Beaufort fortune and the living embodiment of Lancastrian legitimacy. That made her valuable. Too valuable to be left to her own fate. Her mother, Margaret Beauchamp, understood the currency of a child's future in the game of power. The girl was barely 6 when the first marriage contract was inked. She was promised to John de la Pole, son of the Duke of Suffolk, a match designed not for affection, but for the fusion of two great houses. To her, the betrothal meant nothing. She was still playing in castle gardens, her knees muddied from games, her head full of stories told by nurses and chaplains. But in the corridors of power, her name was already a bargaining chip, passed across tables where men weighed bloodlines like gold. The betrothal dissolved as quickly as it was made. The Duke of Suffolk fell from grace, accused of treason, and was murdered before he could stand trial. His son was no longer a prize worth claiming. The parchment that had bound them became worthless. Margaret was withdrawn from one political bargain and placed into the next without ceremony. This was the rhythm of her early life, her future rearranged according to the shifting fortunes of men she had never met. By the age of 12, she had been promised more than once and was learning the unspoken truth: noble girls were not raised for themselves. They were raised for alliances, for treaties sealed in the marriage bed, for children who would carry on the designs of others. Her education was not only in scripture and courtly manners, but in silence, the kind that kept her from questioning what was being done with her life. She would need that silence. Soon, it would be the only armor she had. Here at Quiet Historians HQ, we're telling stories that history books turn into one-line footnotes. If you've been listening for a while and still haven't subscribed, I have to wonder, do you really want these stories to disappear into silence again? Think about it. The contract to bind Margaret Beaufort to John de la Pole was written with ink that had barely dried before it began to rot under the weight of England's shifting loyalties. On paper, it was a union of strength, the Beaufort bloodline joined to the rising influence of William de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk. In the corridors of Westminster, it was spoken of as a match that would fortify the Lancastrian cause for a generation. In truth, it was less about marriage than possession. The girl was an asset to be secured before a rival house could take her. In 15th-century England, betrothal was not a gentle promise of love to come. It was a form of political hostage-taking. Two families bound their fortunes together, and the child at the center of the bargain became a living seal to guarantee the pact. For Margaret, this meant her fate was not her own. She was moved across the chessboard according to the ambitions of men she would never have dared to contradict. At 6 years old, she was already a piece in a game played by those who understood that control of her meant control of the Beaufort legacy. But power was never secure for long. Suffolk's influence over King Henry VI was both his greatest strength and his fatal flaw. In 1444, he had been the architect of a truce with France, one that included the marriage of Henry to Margaret of Anjou. It was meant to end the 100 Years' War, but the price was high. Suffolk agreed to surrender the English-held provinces of Maine and Anjou without a fight. The news spread like poison. To the common people, it was treachery; to the nobility, it was humiliation. The war had drained England of blood and coin, and now, without so much as a skirmish, prized lands were given away. The backlash was swift. Rumors of bribes and secret dealings followed Suffolk through every hall of the court. By 1450, the resentment had boiled into rage. He was accused in Parliament of treason, accused of selling England's honor for his own gain. The king, unwilling to see his favorite stand trial, ordered Suffolk into exile. But he never reached France. Somewhere in the Channel, his ship was intercepted. Chroniclers record that he was dragged to the deck, forced to kneel on a plank, and struck with a sword so dull it took several blows to sever his head. The sea claimed his body, but his disgrace claimed the betrothal. With Suffolk's fall, the alliance that had promised to shield Margaret crumbled. Her engagement to John de la Pole was dissolved before she was old enough to understand the scale of what had happened. One day, she was the future daughter-in-law of one of the king's most trusted men; the next, she was unmoored, her value recalculated by those eager to turn her lineage to their advantage. This was the danger of being born with a name tied to power. A girl could be promised to one man in the morning and another by nightfall. The ceremonies and signatures mattered less than the shifting tides of war and politics. The ink was a formality; the true binding was in the willingness of powerful men to protect, or discard, her when it suited them. Here at Quiet Historians HQ, we bring you the stories that show how power was brokered not just in council chambers, but in the futures of children too young to choose for themselves. If you've been listening this far without subscribing, I have to wonder, are you content to let these lives fade into the dust, remembered only by those who once owned them? When the alliance with the de la Poles collapsed, Margaret's guardians wasted no time finding another match, one stronger, one closer to the throne itself. Their eyes turned to the Tudor brothers, Jasper and Edmund. The Tudors were an anomaly in the noble order, born not of ancient bloodlines but of a scandal that had been awkwardly legitimized. Their father, Owen Tudor, was a Welsh courtier who had secretly married Catherine of Valois, the widowed queen of Henry V. The union had been whispered about in taverns and at court alike, a breach of royal protocol that produced two sons with no claim of their own, until King Henry VI chose to recognize them. Recognition, however, was not the same as unquestioned legitimacy. The Tudors' rise was viewed with suspicion by many of England's entrenched noble families. But Henry VI was their half-brother, and the king's favor outweighed questions of pedigree. Edmund Tudor was granted the title of Earl of Richmond, a position of both wealth and influence. In the volatile landscape of mid-15th century England, marrying him to Margaret Beaufort was more than a union, it was a calculated act of political consolidation. She carried Lancastrian blood from John of Gaunt, he carried the personal trust of the king. Together, their offspring could unite fragile claims into something formidable. In 1455, the arrangement was sealed. Margaret was 12 years old. She had not yet finished growing. Her bones were still lengthening, her hips narrow, her body closer to that of a child than a woman. Yet in the eyes of her guardians, she was ready, not for love, not for partnership, but for the task of producing an heir. In the noble class of the 15th century, marriage at such an age was not met with outrage. It was encouraged. The younger the bride, the more years she could, in theory, bear children. Fertility was measured not by readiness but by potential yield. Modern medicine would call it dangerous. The science is stark: pregnancy before full physical maturity increases the risks of obstructed labor, permanent injury, and death for both mother and child. But in Margaret's world, such dangers were weighed and dismissed against the political value of the child she might produce. If her body was not ready, it would have to learn under pressure. The wedding took place in the great hall of her family's castle. Tapestries of her Beaufort ancestors hung on the walls, silent witnesses to yet another strategic match. Edmund stood beside her, a man in his mid-twenties seasoned by war and the grind of politics. He had spent his adult life in the king's service, she had spent hers in the company of tutors and governesses. They exchanged vows before God, surrounded by the watchful eyes of those who had arranged every moment. The ink was dry, the words spoken, the alliance bound. There was no question of delay. The marriage was consummated at once. No allowance was made for her age, her inexperience, or the fragility of her still developing body. For Margaret, the wedding night was not the beginning of married life but the end of something far more personal, the last fragile edge of her childhood. If you're hearing this and you're thinking, this is madness, that's exactly why Quiet Historians HQ exists. But if you're watching without subscribing, I'm starting to think you'd be fine with stories like this staying buried. Prove me wrong. Winter had settled heavy over Wales when the news came. Edmund Tudor was dead. The official cause was sickness, plague, the sweating sickness, the inevitable toll of damp stone and too many bodies in too small a space. But even in the 15th century, where death was a constant companion, his passing raised whispers. Some said it was a political killing, a convenient removal of a man too close to the king during a time when the Wars of the Roses were sharpening into open conflict. Others hinted at something darker still, execution disguised as illness, a message hidden in the silence that followed. He died in Carmarthen Castle, far from the center of power, in a land that did not entirely trust the Tudor name. And Margaret, barely 13 years old, was left behind, alone, far from home, and carrying his child. The walls of her chamber must have felt like a second coffin. Outside, the winter wind howled against the battlements, carrying with it the smell of wood smoke and the faint rot of wet earth. Inside, she had no allies she could truly trust. As a pregnant widow, she was a prize. Her unborn child was not simply hers, it was a claim, a bargaining chip, and a danger to anyone who feared what that bloodline could become. In noble politics, a widow was vulnerable. A young widow was dangerous. Dangerous to herself, dangerous to those around her, dangerous because her next marriage could shift the balance of power. And Margaret was more than just a young widow, she was a Beaufort. Every decision about her was tangled in the question of who would control the child she carried. Into this uncertainty stepped Jasper Tudor, Edmund's brother. He was a soldier, a man whose loyalty to King Henry VI had already put him in the crosshairs of Yorkist rivals. He had every reason to keep his distance from a situation that might spiral into scandal or worse. Yet he did the opposite, he took personal charge of Margaret's safety. It was not customary for a brother-in-law to assume such a role, not in a formal capacity, and certainly not with a girl of her age and situation. In doing so, Jasper took on a risk that could not be measured simply in battlefield terms. Protecting Margaret meant protecting her unborn child, which meant aligning himself with the potential heir to the Lancastrian cause. It was a statement of loyalty that could cost him everything. The journey from Carmarthen to Jasper's protection was not without danger. Every mile brought the risk of interception, by opportunists seeking ransom, by enemies seeking to erase a threat before it was born, by disease that could strike without warning. Somewhere along that path, the line between duty and something more personal began to blur. Whether it was respect for his brother's memory, belief in Margaret's importance, or an instinct to shield her from the cruelties of the court, Jasper Tudor made sure she would not vanish quietly into political obscurity. And yet, even under his watch, the danger was never gone. The child she carried would either be a pawn or a target, perhaps both at once. Every hand that reached toward her did so with a motive, and every whispered conversation outside her chamber door could just as easily be about her survival as about her destruction. Here at Quiet Historians HQ, we tell the stories that teeter between survival and erasure, the ones too easily swallowed by the polite lies of history books. But if you're listening now, and you've let this channel's work pass you by without subscribing, I have to wonder, when these voices fade, will you even notice the silence? The road to Pembroke was a thin vein of survival carved through a winter that seemed intent on swallowing it whole. Snow clung in jagged ridges along the hedgerows, and the wind cut sideways, carrying with it the taste of salt from the western sea. Margaret's small entourage moved slowly, the horses' hooves striking dull against frozen earth, their breath clouding into the grey air. Every mile was a risk. Blocked roads were not an inconvenience, they were a trap. A fallen tree could be the work of the storm or the work of men who waited just beyond sight with blades and questions no one wanted to answer. River crossings were worse. The water ran high and black, swollen with melt, and the ice that clung to its edges was no promise of safety. The ferrymen, when they came, were men of uncertain allegiance. A wrong name spoken at the wrong moment could turn the crossing into an ambush. The war between Lancaster and York had not yet reached its most savage peaks, but already loyalties shifted like ice flows, breaking and reforming without warning. A knight sworn to Henry VI one winter might swear to Edward of York by spring if the wind of fortune changed. Traveling through this uncertainty meant trusting no one beyond the immediate circle, and even then, trust was only as deep as necessity. Margaret, wrapped in layers of wool and fur, felt every jolt of the cart that carried her. Her pregnancy was far enough along to make each movement an ache. She was 13 and carrying more than a child, she carried the Beaufort name, the Tudor connection, and the fragile thread of a claim to England's future. Those who rode with her knew it. So did those who might wish her journey to end before reaching Pembroke. In her baggage, the preparations for childbirth were modest, shaped by the reality of the 15th century. Swaddling cloths, hand-sewn months before. A small store of herbs. Rue, rosemary, and pennyroyal, not for ornament, but for warding off infection or easing the pains that no midwife could banish entirely. Wax candles blessed by the parish priest, their light meant to drive away the darker forces that birth was thought to invite. In a time when medicine and superstition intertwined, prayers were as essential as water. The midwives who would attend her were not yet at her side, they would be summoned when the time came, drawn from the local women around Pembroke. Until then, she relied on the older servants in her party, women who had seen enough births to know the dangers but not enough to soften their eyes when they looked at her. In the 15th century, childbirth was not spoken of as a beginning but as a trial, a passage through which many women did not return. The journey stretched on, each night a gamble between pressing forward or seeking shelter in some manor or fortified hall. At every hearth, there was the same calculation. Were the hands that offered bread also measuring the value of the guest's absence? And so the slow procession crept toward Pembroke, carrying with it the quiet, unrelenting question, would Margaret reach the castle before her child came, or would the winter claim its own toll first? If this isn't worth a subscribe, I have to wonder what kind of history is worth your time. We're at Quiet Historians HQ bringing you what the chronicles left in the margins. You can scroll away now, but when you forget this story, will you even remember to tell anyone it happened? Pembroke Castle stood cold against the January sky, its walls holding more than stone, they held expectation. The air inside the chamber was thick with tallow smoke, the bitter scent of boiled herbs, and the low murmur of women's voices speaking in the rhythm of work. Margaret lay on the narrow bed, pale against the dark linen, her hands gripping the sheet until her knuckles whitened. The midwives moved around her with brisk precision. They were not gentle, but they were steady. Their trade was survival, not comfort. This was not a birth for family alone. The walls might have hidden the scene from the eyes of men, but they could not shut out the reality that this was a matter of state. Outside the chamber, the echo of boots on stone carried a different kind of urgency, the footsteps of messengers, stewards, and retainers who knew that what happened here could alter the future of the crown. Margaret was a vessel in more ways than one, and everyone in Pembroke understood it. The midwives prepared as custom demanded. A blessed candle burned near the bed, its flicker warding away the spirits said to lurk when new life forced its way into the world. A length of clean linen lay folded, ready to wrap the child before it could be shown to the assembled witnesses who would verify its legitimacy. Near the hearth, a pot of red wine warmed, part medicine, part ritual. To be given to the mother in measured sips to restore her strength or, if needed, steady her for what might come next. Some of the remedies belonged more to the old ways than to the church's blessing. Bundles of dried herbs were burned so their smoke would purify the air. A knife was placed under the bed, not for defense, but to cut the pain. The midwife leading the room wore a rosary around her wrist and a pouch of powdered resin at her belt, ready to be sprinkled across the sheets to guard against what they called the evil eye. But even with these rites, the birth was dangerous for any woman, and doubly so for one so young. Every contraction was not only a struggle for life but a calculation of risk. If she lived, she could be married again. If she died, the child's guardianship, and claim, would pass into the hands of those who might use it for their own ends. In the corridors beyond, conversations were already turning toward the future. Who would raise the boy, should it be a son? Who would control the Beaufort claim, and with it the Tudor bloodline? The child was not yet born, but in the minds of the court, his future was already being traded like coin. For Margaret, this was no abstract game. It was the sound of men deciding the course of her life while she lay gasping in the shadow of death. The moment came suddenly, a cry breaking through the chamber like a fissure in the stone. The child was lifted, blood-wet and screaming, into the dim light. It was a boy. Henry Tudor. His first breath was taken in the midst of prayers and calculations, the two folding together until they were indistinguishable. In that moment, Margaret was both mother and political figure, her survival a private victory shadowed by the public claim she had delivered into the world. For her, the danger was not over. For her son, it had just begun. Here at Quiet Historians HQ, we bring you the histories that begin where others end. The cries behind the crown, the lives caught in the machinery of power. If you're hearing this and thinking it matters, but you haven't subscribed, then I have to wonder, when this story fades, will you let it fade with you? The room had fallen into a heavy stillness once the child was taken to be swaddled. The women moved quietly now, their voices softened, but their eyes told the truth. Margaret had survived, though not unchanged. The birth had left its mark, the kind that does not fade with time or healing. Her body, barely shaped into womanhood, had been torn and strained by the labor it had been forced to endure. The midwives could ease the bleeding, they could soothe her with warmed wine and whispered prayers, but they could not undo the damage. From that night forward, she would never carry another child. It was an unspoken fact, yet everyone close to her seemed to know. In the world she inhabited, a noblewoman's worth was measured in heirs, but Margaret's body had given all it could in one act, at one cost. This frailty would shadow her, a reminder that her survival had been as precarious as the line she had secured for her son. Her relationship with Henry was shaped in this crucible of separation and necessity. From infancy, he was less a child at her side than a figure guarded, educated, and moved like a piece in the larger game. She loved him, there is little doubt, but her love was bound by the distance imposed by circumstance. Letters would replace embraces, and reports from guardians would take the place of watching him grow. When they did meet, there was formality in her presence, the gestures of a woman who understood that her son was both flesh and claim, both hers and England's. The trauma of his birth became a quiet engine driving her life. Margaret's survival seemed to her nothing less than providence. And so she turned, with increasing intensity, to religion, not the mild piety expected of noblewomen, but a deep, consuming devotion that ordered her days and decisions. She heard Mass as many as 5 times daily, fasting beyond the common observances, giving away income to religious houses until her account strained under the weight. One anecdote, whispered among the servants, told of her refusing to sleep on a feather mattress for months during Lent, choosing instead a thin pallet on the floor as penance for sins only she and God could name. Another told of her walking barefoot to chapel in the biting winter air, each step a prayer that her son might live to claim what she believed was his destiny. Her faith was not gentle. It was sharpened by the knowledge of what had been taken from her body, and what she had delivered into the world despite it. She lived as though God had spared her for a purpose, and that purpose was bound to the survival and rise of Henry Tudor. Every act, every alliance, every whispered negotiation that would follow began here, in the still, cold aftermath of a birth that had nearly ended her life. Henry Stafford's Hall was not a home in the way one might imagine for a young widow with a child. It was a shield, a necessary shelter against the shifting winds of power that could just as easily turn lethal. The year had brought the collapse of Lancastrian fortunes. Edward IV, a Yorkist king with the advantage of momentum, now sat the throne. For a woman tied by blood to the Beaufort claim, there was danger in every glance, every whispered conversation that carried her name. The marriage to Stafford was deliberate, not romantic. He was well-connected, cautious, and, most importantly, he was aligned, at least outwardly, with the Yorkist crown. To bind herself to him was to step into a house that could plausibly claim loyalty to Edward, even as her heart and bloodline lay with the exiles across the sea. In these years, survival was not a matter of force, but of quiet calculation. A wrong word could strip away everything. Margaret learned the delicate art of existing in 2 worlds at once. Publicly, she was the dutiful wife of a man who acknowledged the Yorkist order. She attended feasts where Yorkist banners hung overhead, spoke politely to those who had fought against her own kin, and kept her tone neutral when the victories of Edward IV were celebrated. Privately, she kept a different network alive. The bizarre truth is that she never lost contact with the Lancastrian exiles, not the scattered lords in Scotland, not the loyalists in Brittany, not even her half-brother Jasper Tudor. It was an invisible thread she managed to weave through letters sent under the cover of harmless domestic correspondence, through trusted servants who knew how to pass a message without leaving a trace. The Yorkists must have suspected her sympathies, yet she was never arrested, never formally accused of treason. This was not luck. It was the performance of a lifetime. Every smile given to a Yorkist noble was a calculated act, every expression of loyalty carefully measured to be just enough. In an age where suspicion alone could condemn a person, Margaret survived by mastering invisibility in plain sight. Her life in Stafford's household was not without tension. To balance the expectations of her husband with her quiet allegiance to the Lancastrian cause required a discipline most could not sustain. But Margaret was no ordinary court pawn, she was a strategist shaped by the knowledge that her son's claim could only live if she did. Every banquet attended under Yorkist colours, every harmless-seeming visit to a neighbouring manor, was part of a greater game that would not be revealed for years. In those years, Margaret's son lived more in her thoughts than in her arms. Henry was in the care of others, Jasper tutor when fortune allowed, trusted allies when it did not. She might see him once, perhaps twice in a year, and always under circumstances controlled by politics, not maternal longing. Each meeting was brief, carefully staged, and shadowed by the knowledge that separation would follow as soon as the visit ended. So she learned to be a mother from a distance. Her tools were parchment, ink, and a network of couriers whose loyalty was worth more than gold. Letters had to be more than words, they had to be shields, teaching him who to trust, what to notice, and what to keep hidden. Every line was weighed for meaning. The wrong phrase, if intercepted, could be used to prove treason. Margaret mastered the art of writing 2 letters at once, the one seen by prying eyes and the one read by her son. Beneath the careful mentions of health, household news, and saints' feast days, there were layers of instruction. Sometimes the key was in the rhythm of the sentences. Sometimes it was in the choice of an oddly specific proverb. A few words changed in the right place could turn a polite update into a warning or a command. She sent him gifts too, not lavish tokens, but small, personal objects meant to tether him to her. A prayer book with marginalia in her own hand, a piece of cloth embroidered with symbols only they would understand, a tiny relic of a saint tied in ribbon. In a world where alliances shifted overnight, such objects became anchors, reminders that his bloodline carried a destiny neither Yorkist victory nor physical distance could erase. The couriers themselves were part of a world few outside the political underground ever saw. Servants pretending to carry messages for trade negotiations, merchants slipping letters into the lining of a saddle, women delivering correspondence tucked inside the hollow base of a candle. Some were paid in coin, others in protection. All of them knew the risk, being caught meant imprisonment, and possibly death. Through this fragile network, Margaret shaped her son's mind. She could not be there to guide his daily choices, but she could plant the seeds of caution, ambition, and loyalty. She could teach him to survive until the moment came when survival would no longer be enough. If you're hearing this part and not feeling the weight of it, maybe history isn't for you. And if you are feeling it but still haven't subscribed to Quiet Historians HQ, you're letting these stories drift back into the shadows. The final collapse of the Lancastrian cause did not come as a sudden blow to Margaret, it was a slow, suffocating constriction, like a noose tightening over years until breath itself became a calculated risk. By the late 1470s, every road her son could take led toward danger. Yorkist eyes were everywhere, and their justice for traitors was swift. In Henry's case, it would not be justice at all. It would be erasure. The decision to send him into exile was not made lightly. It was the choice between seeing him die in England or vanish into the uncertainty of foreign soil. His escape was not the romantic dash some later imagined, it was a deliberate, perilous thread through corridors of shifting loyalty. One whisper to the wrong ear, one glance caught by the wrong man, and the boy's blood would have been spilled on English ground. Brittany was no sanctuary of pure goodwill. The Duke of Brittany played a careful game, sheltering Henry not out of affection but calculation. In his hands, the young Lancastrian heir was less a guest and more a coin to be traded when the moment was right. England's rival France wanted him, England's Yorkist king feared him, and Brittany could profit from either side. Henry was lodged well enough to survive, but never so comfortably that he could forget he was a pawn on another man's board. For Margaret, the separation was now measured not in counties but in hostile seas. Every letter to her son crossed through the gauntlet of enemy ports, intercepted ships, and the wary eyes of officials who understood that a single page could tilt the balance of power. Couriers had to be chosen with even greater care, men who could pose as traders in cloth or salt, women who could hide thin strips of parchment in the lining of a gown or in the wax of a seemingly ordinary candle. Communication became rarer, slower, and more dangerous. Sometimes, by the time a letter reached its destination, the situation it described had already changed. Yet Margaret persisted. Her words had to serve double duty now, advising her son on his safety, while also shaping his readiness for a future that neither of them could see clearly. A misstep in either could doom him. She knew he was alive only because the silence had not yet broken. No news, in those years, was the closest thing to hope. Every day was a gamble played with distance, politics, and time. And yet, she endured. Because if she did not keep the thread between them alive, even in whispers and shadows, there would be no future worth enduring for at all. Thomas Stanley was not a man to be loved. He was a man to be used, if you could keep pace with him. His reputation was already carved into England's political memory, the lord who could stand still in a battle long enough to see which way the wind turned, then suddenly ride to the winning side, claiming it had been his intent all along. To some, this made him treacherous. To others, it made him brilliant. To Margaret Beaufort, it made him necessary. Her choice to marry him was no romantic turn of fate. It was calculation. She had survived long enough to know that safety was a mirage in these years of shifting banners. You did not seek shelter in stone walls, you sought it in men who could walk through every hall in England without being chained. Stanley was exactly that man. He had the trust of Yorkist kings, the friendship of nobles on both sides, and, most importantly, the rare gift of being underestimated. Margaret knew how to bend that to her advantage. Where others saw Stanley's infamous neutrality as cowardice, she saw it as mobility. His loyalty was not to any one crown, but to his own survival, and that meant he could be steered, carefully, toward her own ends. The marriage gave her something she had not had since her youth, reach. With Stanley's network, her eyes and ears multiplied. Messengers rode roads that had been closed to her for years. Servants in rival households found themselves in her quiet employ. Inns, market stalls, and small parish gatherings became places where whispers could be gathered and sent along. She did not have to leave her chambers to know the mood in London, the latest quarrel between noble houses, or the rumors of foreign alliances. Stanley himself may not have shared her singular devotion to the Lancastrian cause, but he understood power, and Margaret made sure he understood that her ambitions were not a threat to his. She framed her requests as matters of mutual security. A courier here, a quiet inquiry there, each favor small enough to seem harmless, but together, they stitched a network across England strong enough to carry news faster than some royal messengers. For the first time in years, she could act, not just react. She could shape events from a distance, guiding her son's cause without ever drawing a sword. And while Stanley's own loyalties were fluid, his name, and the reach it brought, was a weapon she wielded as deftly as any general wields an army. It was a partnership forged in necessity, sustained by caution, and sharpened by the unspoken understanding that when the final moment came, each would have to decide whether to hold the other's hand, or let go. The summer of 1483 cast a shadow that swallowed even the most fortified hearts. Word moved fast through England's great houses. Edward IV was dead, his young son Edward V was to take the throne, and Richard, Duke of Gloucester, had been named protector until the boy came of age. It sounded like a temporary arrangement, a safeguard. But Margaret Beaufort had lived too long in the cracks between promises to believe such a role would be relinquished willingly. Then came the whispers. The boy king never made it to his coronation. His younger brother joined him in the Tower of London, supposedly for their safety, and the gates closed behind them. Windows shuttered, guards rotated, and the world outside began to murmur about what was really happening in those cold stone walls. Margaret understood what few dared to say aloud: if the boys were gone, the line of succession twisted in ways that could be exploited. Richard's claim to the throne, born from careful legal manipulation, would now rest unchallenged unless someone forced the challenge. And in the shadows of her mind, that someone had a name. Henry. She moved with a quiet, dangerous urgency. Messages went out under false names, carried by servants who never spoke of their errands. Men were approached who could raise ships, soldiers, and coin. It was more than rebellion, it was an invasion she was building from the hearths and halls of England itself. She coordinated with exiled Lancastrians, French sympathizers, and disaffected Yorkists who had grown uneasy under Richard's tightening grip. Every strand of her network hummed with possibility. The plan was brutal in its simplicity. Henry would land with an army, march under a banner that promised both justice for the missing princes and a unifying claim to the throne through his Beaufort blood. The people, desperate for stability, would rally. Richard would fall. But history rarely bends without breaking first. The first attempt faltered before it ever truly began, ships caught in storms, forces scattered, plans exposed. Richard struck swiftly. Margaret found herself under house arrest, her movements restricted, her communication monitored. It was a cage without bars, but a cage all the same. Still, the silence of the princes haunted England. And in that silence, Margaret heard an opportunity that had not yet died. The Tower might have swallowed 2 boys, but it had also cracked the illusion of Richard's rightful rule. She would bide her time, feeding her networks, waiting for the tide to turn again. If you can hear me telling you this, it means I've done my part to bring the past back to life. If you don't want to keep it alive by subscribing to Quiet Historians HQ, at least explain in the comments why you're okay with letting it fade again. The morning of August 22, 1485, broke under a pale, misted sky, the kind that dampened sound and made the world feel as if it were holding its breath. On the slopes near Bosworth, 2 armies faced each other. The long-reigning Yorkists under Richard III, and the smaller, leaner force of Henry Tudor, carrying the weight of exile and a lifetime of waiting. Margaret Beaufort was nowhere near the battlefield, but her influence lay in the marrow of what was about to unfold. She had wagered everything on one gamble, that her third husband, Thomas Stanley, the most calculating opportunist in England, would not betray her son. Stanley had arrived with thousands of men, enough to tilt the balance of power in either direction, but he held them back, watching, waiting, making both kings think they had his loyalty. The air was thick with the stench of churned mud and the iron tang of anticipation. Richard made his move first, a furious cavalry charge aimed directly at Henry, determined to end the rebellion with one swift stroke. It should have worked. Henry's forces were scattered enough to crumble under such a strike. But this was the moment Margaret's gamble came due. Stanley's banners shifted. Men who had stood still all morning began to move, down the slope, into Richard's flank. It was treachery executed with surgical precision, and in that instant, the tide turned. Richard, unyielding to the end, fought on foot when his horse was killed beneath him, refusing retreat. But he was swallowed in the crush of blades and bodies, the crown lost in the mud before being placed on Henry's head there on the battlefield. Henry Tudor, the boy born in the shadow of scandal, now stood as King Henry VII. And Margaret Beaufort, from a distance, had altered the course of English history with one betrayal that wasn't hers to wield, but hers to inspire. She had survived wars, widowhood, political exile, and the ruin of her own body to see this moment happen. The banners changed that day, but so did the rules of power. For Margaret, this was not the end, it was the beginning of an entirely new game. In the months that followed Bosworth, the halls of Westminster echoed with a new kind of power. Quiet, deliberate, and often invisible to the untrained eye. Margaret Beaufort did not wear a crown, yet she was treated as though she did. Her son, Henry VII, now ruled England, but she had positioned herself as the constant shadow at his side, the one adviser whose counsel he would never question. From the moment he entered London in triumph, she was not merely the king's mother. She was my lady the king's mother, a title unprecedented in English court. She signed documents in her own name, kept her own household, and, most unusual of all, was given the right to walk beside the king in public. In an age when even queens were expected to step a pace behind, Margaret walked level. Every stride she took was a reminder to the court that this reign had been bought not only with blood, but with her lifetime of political calculation. Her relationship with Henry was one of mutual dependence. He was the sovereign, but she was the architect of his survival. She guarded him with the same precision she had once guarded his memory during his years in exile, controlling access to him, weighing the intentions of every courtier, and ensuring no decision was made without her knowledge. Yet she was careful never to overshadow him publicly. Her power was exercised in rooms behind closed doors, where words mattered more than banners. When Henry married Elizabeth of York, uniting the warring houses and symbolically ending the Wars of the Roses, Margaret played the role of peacemaker with exacting skill. Elizabeth was young, gracious, and beloved by the people, but she was not the strategist Margaret was. Their relationship was cordial, though marked by Margaret's constant presence in matters of protocol and influence. She arranged ceremonies, dictated etiquette, and even oversaw aspects of the royal household, weaving herself into the fabric of daily governance. The irony was bitter yet undeniable. All of this power, all of this survival, had been purchased with the ruin of her own youth. She had entered womanhood in the agony of a childbirth she was too small to endure, her body left forever altered. She had known widowhood before most knew marriage, had lived more years apart from her son than with him. Every alliance she formed, every marriage she accepted, had been a move on a board where a single mistake meant ruin. And yet, here she stood, at the pinnacle of English politics, the matriarch of a new dynasty. The Tudor rose would become the emblem of peace after decades of war, but it was also her personal emblem, red for the blood she had endured, white for the silence she had mastered. If you trace the root of it all, the treaties, the betrayals, the battlefield victories, you end up back in a small, dim chamber at Pembroke Castle. Back to the night when a 13-year-old girl labored through the dark hours while the fate of a kingdom waited outside her door. The night when her body broke, but her will hardened into something unshakable. It was a birth that should never have happened, and yet it forged a king. From that night, through decades of war and exile, to the moment her son placed the Tudor crown on his head, Margaret Beaufort carried England's future in her hands. And now you've heard her story, not the sanitized footnote, but the raw truth. If you've stayed with me this far and still haven't subscribed to Quiet Historians HQ, I have to ask, do you truly want the stories that shaped this world to fade back into the silence they came from?